All creatives have a general idea of how they want their story to play out across its entire run before they get started. Even if that idea changes drastically as they actually sit down to write it, you should at least have some kind of roadmap, even if you have no idea what the destination will look like. Creatives know this, and audiences know it as well, but even so, there are still those shows that take us completely by surprise. Some shows end exactly as they promised they would, or how audiences expected them to. Sometimes they end in a way that's different, but not totally out of left field. We're not talking about either of those. Instead, we're talking about the shows that went in the most insane directions with their story, tone, production, and characters that no one at the time saw coming. Whether for good or for bad, and trust me, there is some bad on its way, these shows went out on a very different note from where they started. With that in mind, I'm Will for Whatculture, and here are 10 TV shows that were unrecognizable when they finished. Number 10. Buffy the Vampire Slayer left high school drama behind. One can hardly imagine the confusion folks must have felt back in the 90s when this show was announced. I mean, really, that forgettable high school vampire action comedy getting its own TV show. But sure enough, Joss Whedon and the team at Mutant Enemy made it work. While the first 2 seasons would feature Buffy and friends dealing with supernatural forces that just so happened to also be good metaphors for average teenage problems, the show would take a hard right into something much more come season 3 and beyond. Buffy ran for 7 seasons, and what made the show stand out at the time was that it took place in real time. In 3 seasons, Buffy graduates high school, and the rest of the show is her going through college, graduating from that, and then living as an adult. So, as you can imagine, the show looks and feels very different at the end compared to when it first started. The cast is older and much larger, the stories ran longer, and generally things just kept getting ratcheted up all the way up until it ended. 9. Dollhouse went from procedural to apocalyptic sci-fi. Dollhouse started off as a boilerplate, mediocre Fox procedural drama with the sci-fi twist of centering around a company that rents out humans with personalities downloaded off a computer. However, never let it be said that Whedon isn't willing to do something crazy to keep people hooked. If you were to tune in to the final season of Dollhouse, what you would find is something completely different to what I just described. The show, by its end, was full-on sci-fi set in a post-apocalyptic future, with the characters' clean and form-fitting attire swapped out for ragged military and survival gear. It was definitely a ballsy move on Whedon's part, though not enough to save the image of Dollhouse in the eyes of Whedonites. It just didn't quite have enough that was unique to it to convince them to keep tuning in, even when it went full Fallout on everyone. 8. Avatar: The Last Airbender's look and characters changed completely. With the best shows out there, you never realize how much better the production quality is until you've seen the first and last seasons side by side with one another. If any show is proof of this, it has to be Avatar: The Last Airbender. It helps that the show always looked really good, but as the show went on, the animation got smoother, the colors more vibrant, the characters more expressive, and generally a show that oozed atmosphere from the start turned into one that drowned you in the feel of its world. But more than that, the characters changed remarkably. We all knew from the start that Aang was going to become the Avatar he was always meant to be, and by episode 3 we all hoped against hope that Zuko would choose the right path. But who could have predicted meek and sweet Katara becoming the tank of the group, or sarcastic, kinda wimpy Sokka becoming a master swordsman and tactical genius? Despite how the show constantly reminded us where its endgame was going to be, the show was hardly recognizable when it got there, and God bless it for that. 7. Scrubs lost the main core cast and the quality. One of the poster boys for screwing up a victory lap after you've already crossed the finish line, the final season of Scrubs is infamous among fans for taking the already perfect ending of the show and basically invalidating it. For 8 seasons, fans tuned in to the day-to-day adventures of the awkward John as he works his way up the ranks of the Sacred Heart Hospital, making us sob with both laughter and crippling depression. But when season 8 wrapped up, Scrubs decided it wanted to go out with the best possible ending for a show like this. However, they did get another season, and unfortunately, the quality just wasn't there. Oh sure, the actors did what they could, the increase in production quality was appreciated in places, but the new characters didn't grab anyone and the jokes missed more than they hit, and generally it felt like a show on life support. Thankfully, it didn't take long for it to end for good, so it avoided the fate of shows like The Simpsons. 6. Veronica Mars ditched its best group dynamics. Veronica Mars, for those who don't know, was, for 2 seasons, one of the best shows to air on the CW. A thrilling, young adult noir series centering around a teenage girl whose life falls apart in ways I honestly don't feel comfortable discussing, and who decides to set up her own private investigation business in order to solve a mystery even the police are hopeless against. It was genuinely compelling teen drama, mostly because it wasn't afraid to get into the nitty-gritty details and take advantage of the dark tone associated with noir. While season 3 tried to continue this, it was let down by poor creative decisions, some made because the showrunner knew the show was ending and thought that maybe making a crap ending would somehow fix that, and some were planned from the start, and so there's no excuse at all. This included a bad mystery that is downright offensive to victims of sexual assault, ditching many of the great group dynamics from the previous 2 seasons and not replacing them with anything good, and of course, that's truly awful ending. 5. Torchwood became harder sci-fi in Season 3. When Doctor Who came crashing back onto the BBC in 2005, you could hear the overjoyed British squealing from all the way in the States, who wouldn't even care about Doctor Who until Matt Smith showed up. But because the USA mostly ignored Doctor Who during its reboot's first 2 eras, they also ignored the excellent spin-off show Torchwood. Like Buffy and Supernatural before it, Torchwood was a case of the week show with a sci-fi twist centering around the ever-lovable baby-faced hero himself, Captain Jack Harkness, working with the eponymous organization to fight extraterrestrial threats. But when Season 3 strolled around, the writers decided they wanted to do things just a bit differently this time around. Namely, they changed the title of the show to Torchwood Children of Earth and began to ground the show just a bit more into harder sci-fi instead of copying Doctor Who's wibbly-wobbly approach. They told one gigantic story over the entire season and raked in the accolades as a result. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it work in quite the same way twice in Season 4, and the show ended soon after. But that doesn't change the fact that such a radical shift in tone and story structure did work wonders for them in their latter half. 4. Baywatch left the beach behind. There are few properties more essentially 80s than Baywatch. You name every single 80s TV trope and Baywatch has not only done it, but has kept a detailed checklist of when, where, and how many times. The original incarnation of the show has been parodied so many times that you could construct at least 2 whole episodes out of those parodies. While the show was never unsuccessful, the producers felt that the exclusive beach setting was narrowing their appeal somewhat. After all, there are only so many stories you can tell on a Californian coastline, apparently. A reasonable conclusion in itself, but their solution, Baywatch Nights, was to try and make the winning Hasselhoff formula work in a gritty, prime-time cop drama. Obviously, this did not work at all. So their solution to this problem that they created to solve a problem that, once again, they only thought that they might have in the future was to do what the rest of Hollywood was doing and rip off the X-Files. Now Hasselhoff was fighting vampires and sea monsters. Yeah, the show got cancelled pretty quick afterwards. 3. Angel goes from supernatural detective procedural to supernatural law procedural. Our third and final Joss Whedon show on this list, Angel distinguished itself from its predecessor Buffy the Vampire Slayer right off the bat by being significantly darker. Buffy went to some dark places, but when your spin-off show stars a guy who literally cannot be happy for fear of turning into a powerful, genocidal, utterly insane vampire, you tend to have the advantage. Throughout the first seasons of Angel, we saw the brooding vampire butt heads with Wolfram and Hart, a corrupt and very powerful law firm that was tied up in a lot of demonic business. However, right at the start of Season 5, Wolfram and Hart hired Angel and his team to run the LA branch of the firm. Anyone who tuned into this season the first time spent every episode thinking that this was the one where Wolfram and Hart tipped their hand to show this was all an elaborate evil plan. But instead, the premise completely shifts, as Angel and pals acclimate very quickly to their new roles and the show becomes more of a lawyer procedural with a supernatural twist, instead of the vampire cop drama that it was before. 2. Venture Bros ditched the parody and became its own thing. If there is any truly binding law in this universe, it's this. Never, ever let your guard down around an Adult Swim show. Adult Swim prides itself on its experimental content, so it only makes sense that said content would change and grow and shift itself into new forms as they go on for longer. Frankly, we could have filled this whole list with shows from the late night block, but we managed to boil it down to just two. The first being Venture Bros, a one-joke parody centering around shows like Johnny Quest, particularly mocking its insane mythology, unrealistic child characters, and how Johnny Quest's father was the real main character of the show when you get right down to it. Venture Bros has been around a long time, and in keeping with Adult Swim's programming, they could have just kept driving in that joke until they bore through the earth and let the anti-comedy do the rest. But instead, the show, almost casually, just drops the parody altogether and starts building its own narrative. Oh sure, it still remembers that it's a comedy, but in between the jokes, they add in dense internal world building, genuinely three-dimensional characters, and a narrative that keeps you hooked. Frankly, there's only one other Adult Swim show that commits to such a drastic change in how it tells its story. 1. Moral Oral went from funny to utterly depressing. By now, anyone who watches a show on Adult Swim knows to expect a massive gear shift in tone, story, and content at some point during the show's run. But Moral Oral came out during Adult Swim's formative years, when audiences had no idea what to expect from the block's programs. Needless to say, no one saw it coming when Moral Oral tipped its hand. The weird thing is that the subject matter of the show never really changes, even when it undergoes its radical tone shift in Season 3. It's still about dissecting the underlying darkness of how that bygone era of television portrayed family dynamics, religion, gender roles, and the idea of marriage. The only thing that changed when Season 3 pulled the rug out from under us is that the show stopped portraying what was happening as funny, instead morphing into one of the bleakest, most depressing shows on television, ending on an image that doesn't so much make you cry as it leaves you utterly destroyed and numbly staring at the wall. No other show in the history of television has a bigger gap in tone, character, and story between its beginning and ending than Moral Oral.